The floor of the cave is still, but it is not empty. Beneath a skin of dust, under mineral crusts laid down one slow drop at a time, the ground holds signs that something once moved here with purpose, not an animal dragging itself toward shelter, not rainwater sorting pebbles by accident. Something entered the dark, crossed the stone, and left behind a trace that should not be where it is, or as old as it appears to be. The air inside such a place feels almost separate from the world above, sealed away from seasons, empires, languages, and names. Outside, landscapes change, ice advances and retreats, rivers cut new paths, forests rise and vanish. Inside, the cave waits. The discovery begins with that unsettling stillness. A chamber is reached, or reopened, or examined with new instruments, and suddenly the familiar story of human history begins to loosen at the edges. For a long time, people have liked to imagine the past as a staircase: first crude survival, then tools, then fire, then art, then belief, then civilization. It is a comforting shape, because it makes the present seem like the natural summit of everything that came before. But caves have a habit of ruining comfortable shapes. They preserve what open ground destroys. They keep bones where sunlight cannot bleach them, footprints where wind cannot erase them, pigments where rain cannot wash them away. They also preserve mistakes in human certainty. The cave at the heart of this story is not simply a hole in the earth. It is a locked archive, and the lock is time. To enter it is to step into a place where the deep human past refuses to behave neatly. A mark on a wall may look simple until it is dated. A stone object may seem ordinary until it is found far below a layer that should make it impossible. A bone may appear to belong to a known species until its shape, its age, or its DNA opens a door into a population no one expected. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does in archaeology. But what survives in the record suggests something profound. The human story was never a single line marching forward. It was a thicket of experiments, migrations, extinctions, encounters, and forgotten intelligences. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this is not a story about one cave alone. It is about what caves do to history. They take the proud, polished version of the past and pull it down into the dark, where it must face older evidence. For most of recorded history, people looking into caves saw entrances to other worlds. Some were shelters, some were tombs, some were feared as the homes of spirits, animals, or the dead. Long before archaeology gave them grid squares and sample bags, caves were places of memory. They were also dangerous. A person entering deep limestone passages without modern light leaves the ordinary human world almost immediately. Sound changes. Distance becomes uncertain. A hand held before the face disappears. In that darkness, every decision matters: where to step, how to breathe, how much flame remains, whether the path behind can still be found. So when evidence appears deep inside a cave, far beyond daylight, it carries a special weight. It suggests not only presence, but intention. That is one of the first things that makes these discoveries so difficult to dismiss. Animals use caves, of course. Bears sleep in them. Hyenas drag bones into them. Birds and bats leave traces by the thousands. Water moves sediment in ways that can fool the eye. But a pattern of marks, a carefully placed object, a hearth, a footprint trail, or repeated activity in chambers far from the entrance begins to speak a different language. It tells us that someone chose the dark. Someone carried light inside. Someone returned, Perhaps more than once. Scholars still debate what such acts meant, but they are not casual details. They imply memory, planning, and a relationship with place. The shock of a cave discovery often comes from the date attached to it. Archaeology is full of objects that are strange, but strangeness alone does not rewrite history. Age does. A painted animal from 15,000 years ago is astonishing, but it fits comfortably within what is already known about late Ice Age humans. A burial from 30,000 years ago expands the story, but does not overturn it. Yet when marks, structures, pigments, footprints, or remains appear tens of thousands of years earlier than expected, or are linked to a human relative once dismissed as incapable, the ground shifts. The question stops being simply, what is this? And becomes, who were they? And what else have we misunderstood? Modern science has made caves even more powerful as witnesses. Tiny fragments of DNA can survive in sediment without visible bones. Mineral deposits can be dated with techniques unknown to earlier generations. Microscopic residues can reveal fire, pigments, plant fibers, or animal fats. Laser scanning can expose engravings almost invisible to the naked eye. A floor that once looked like packed mud may become a record of footsteps, hearths, occupation surfaces, and long-forgotten collapses. The cave does not give up its secrets easily, but it gives them differently now. And this is where the old boundaries begin to blur. For many years, the most human things were assigned to Homo sapiens with a kind of automatic confidence. Art, symbolic behavior, deliberate burial, long-distance planning, complex tools, perhaps even a sense of the sacred. These were treated as the signatures of us. Other human relatives might be clever, resilient, and physically adapted to difficult worlds, but they were often placed just outside the circle of true imagination. Then the caves began answering back. Evidence associated with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient humans has made that circle much harder to draw. No single discovery settles every argument, but together they have made the old hierarchy look too simple. The cave discovery that rewrites human history does not need to reveal a lost kingdom or a golden chamber. In fact, the most important finds often look modest at first. A finger bone, a line of pigment, a ring of broken mineral formations, a child's tooth, a footprint hardened in ancient mud. These are not the treasures of kings. They are quieter than that, and more dangerous to certainty. They belong to a time before writing, before cities, before farming, before the names of peoples were recorded by anyone at all. They force history to stretch backward into prehistory, and prehistory to become more human than it once appeared. There is a particular humility that comes from standing before such evidence. The people who made it did not know they were part of a grand human timeline. They were not waiting to become ancient. They were hungry, cold, curious, afraid, inventive, social, and mortal. They moved through landscapes filled with animals now extinct, climates unlike our own, and other human groups whose stories ended before writing began. Their world was not primitive to them. It was complete. The cave, sealed by accident and patience, has kept a few fragments of that completeness. And yet the mystery remains sharp because the cave does not explain itself. A mark is not a sentence. A bone is not a biography. A tool is not a memory. Scientists can measure, compare, date, and model, but interpretation still requires caution. No single explanation fully accounts for every strange trace found underground. Some evidence points toward survival, some points toward ritual. Some may record ordinary activity that only seems mysterious because so little else survives. The task is not to force the cave into a legend, but to listen carefully to what the evidence can bear. So the story begins in darkness, where the human past is older, wider, and less obedient than expected. Above the cave, the modern world continues with its roads, lights, maps, and confident timelines. Below, in a chamber that may have waited through ice ages and extinctions, something remains that complicates everything. It is not the whole story of humanity. It is worse than that. It is a fragment small enough to fit in a hand, old enough to break an assumption, and silent enough to keep scholars arguing long after the first excitement fades. Outside the cave, the world is not yet the world people know. The land has a different temperament. Coastlines do not always sit where they sit now. Rivers run through valleys that may later drown beneath seas or dry into dust. Forests advance in warmer centuries, then retreat when cold tightens its grip. Herds move across open country in patterns older than memory. The air itself seems to belong to another earth, one that is recognizably home and yet strangely unfinished. Because the familiar human order has not yet settled over it. There are no fields, no roads, no villages rising around wells, no walls marking borders, no names fixed to mountains. There is only terrain, weather, hunger, fire, and movement. To understand why a cave discovery can overturn history, the land around it must be imagined first. A cave is never just an interior. It is part of a living landscape. Its entrance faces a valley, a cliff, a river bend, a wooded slope, a plain where animals pass, or a hidden pocket of shelter in hostile country. In prehistory, such places matter with an intensity that later societies sometimes forget. A cave may offer shade in punishing heat, protection from wind, a lookout over migration routes, a dry place to sleep, or simply a reliable landmark in a world without maps. What survives in the record suggests that ancient humans and human relatives did not wander at random. They learned landscapes deeply, returning to places that offered advantage, memory, or meaning. The world before modern humans dominate the story is crowded, but not with cities. It is crowded with other lives. Mammoths graze in cold steppe environments in some regions. Giant deer lift antlers like branching trees. Cave bears use underground chambers long before people enter them with torches. Hyenas crack bones with a force that can scatter evidence and confuse later archaeologists. In warmer refuges, forests hold aurochs, wild horses, deer, boar, and predators that track the same animals humans need. The exact cast changes by continent and climate, but the principle remains early. People live inside ecosystems of enormous power. They are hunters, scavengers, gatherers, makers, trackers, and prey. Their intelligence does not remove them from nature. It is one of their survival tools within it. This is one reason caves preserve such complicated stories. Human traces often sit beside animal traces, and the two can be difficult to separate. A bone with cut marks may speak of butchery. A bone cracked by carnivore teeth tells another story. A layer of ash may be a hearth, or it may have washed in from outside, or it may be disturbed by later burrowing. Archaeology begins in this uncertainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and the deeper the time, the more careful the claims must be. But in the best preserved caves, layers build like pages: silt, ash, stone, bone, pollen, mineral crust, collapsed debris, and human debris accumulate together. The cave becomes less like a single room and more like a slow machine for holding time. Before Homo sapiens becomes the last surviving human species, the planet contains multiple kinds of humans. This fact alone changes the emotional shape of the story. The past was not simply animal and then us. It was animal, and us, and others like us but not us, living close enough in time to overlap, and sometimes close enough in space to meet. Neanderthals occupy much of Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans, known at first from fragments so small they might have seemed almost insulting to history, leave genetic traces across Asia and Oceania. Other human populations, some known from bones, others mostly from DNA, appear and disappear in the deep record. Scholars still debate how many groups should be named as distinct species, populations, or lineages. But the old image of a single human ladder has collapsed. In this older world, modern humans are not inevitable rulers. They are one form among several, carrying their own adaptations, vulnerabilities, and possibilities. In Africa, Homo sapiens emerges within a continent of shifting climates and diverse environments, not from a single neat birthplace, but from a complex pattern of populations, separations, and reconnections. Beyond Africa, other humans have already learned cold valleys, high plateaus, forests, and coasts. Some know how to survive winters that would kill the unprepared. Some shape stone with skill refined over immense stretches of time. Some hunt large animals, some use pigments, some may bury their dead or mark their spaces in ways still disputed. The discovery of a cave connected to any of these behaviors matters because it asks whether the spark of symbolic or complex thought belonged only to one branch, or whether it glowed more widely in the human family. The landscape itself pushes this question. Deep time is not gentle. Climate swings can transform a region within the lifetime of a culture, even if not always within the lifetime of one person. A valley that supports herds and edible plants may become colder, drier, or more unpredictable. A coastline may retreat, opening plains that later vanish underwater. A desert may turn green for a few thousand years, then close again like a door. The people moving through these worlds must adapt constantly. They follow water, animals, seasons, stone sources, and perhaps stories passed between generations. They learn which caves are dry, which contain dangerous animals, which hold echoes, which lead deep into the earth, and which are worth returning to. One lesser-known detail about prehistoric cave landscapes is that many entrances visible in the past are gone now, while others that seem prominent today may not have been accessible in the same way. Rockfalls conceal chambers, erosion can open passages, rivers can cut away slopes, sea levels can drown entire coastal cave systems, carrying away evidence of people who once lived near shorelines. This means the archaeological record is not merely incomplete by accident. It is biased by geology. We find what survived in places that happened to preserve it. Countless camps, paths, shelters, and moments of thought have been erased, leaving caves to speak too loudly in some regions and too softly in others. Still, caves speak because they gather. They gather smoke on ceilings, footprints in clay, broken tools in sediment, bones in corners, pigments under mineral films, and DNA in dirt. They gather the traces of brief visits and long occupations. They gather fear and practicality together. A family sheltering near an entrance during bad weather leaves one kind of record. A small group moving deep into darkness to mark a wall leaves another. A carnivore den creates yet another. Later humans may return thousands of years afterward, never knowing they step above older lives. The cave does not care. It layers them all. In the world before us, time is not measured by dynasties but by ice, stone, and bone. 1,000 years is almost too small a unit to feel. Entire traditions of tool-making can last longer than the age of written civilization. A method learned by one generation may pass to another and another until the original inventors are unimaginably remote. This can make prehistoric cultures seem static from a distance, but that is partly an illusion created by the roughness of surviving evidence. A stone tool may look similar across vast spans of time, while the songs, gestures, family bonds, warnings, and beliefs around it vanish completely. What remains is durable matter, not the full life that produced it. The cave discovery enters this world not as an isolated miracle, but as a pressure point. It captures a moment when some ancient group interacts with darkness in a way that outlives them. Perhaps they leave marks. Perhaps they deposit bodies. Perhaps they make structures from broken stone. Perhaps they carry fire where no daylight reaches. Whatever the exact evidence, its importance depends on the world outside a world of multiple humans, shifting climates, vanished animals, and landscapes that do not yet belong to history but already belong to memory. The cave is not separate from that world. It is one of its hidden organs. And so, before the first artifact is lifted, before the first date is announced, before the first argument begins in a laboratory or journal, the stage has already been set by deep time. The cave waits within a landscape that is alive, dangerous, and changing. The beings who approach it are not simple figures in a primitive dawn. They are survivors of a planet in motion. They know things they cannot write down. They carry knowledge in bodies, hands, roots, scars, and habits. Some of that knowledge disappears forever. Some of it, by chance, enters the cave and stays there. The first traces inside the cave are not grand enough to announce themselves. They do not shine. They do not speak in the language of treasure. They wait in the dull colours of ancient sediment, in the angle of a broken stone, in a smear of charcoal, in the faint geometry of marks that almost vanish unless the light is held just right. This is one of the strange truths of deep history. The smallest remains often carry the greatest disturbance. A gold mask can confirm a kingdom. A clay tablet can name a ruler, but a few footprints in old mud, a fragment of bone, or a line drawn in darkness can reach farther back than any crown and unsettle the entire idea of what it means to be human. At first, a cave gives confusion before it gives evidence. The floor is uneven, layers tilt and pinch out, stones fall from ceilings and become mixed with older deposits, animals enter and die, water seeps through cracks, carrying minerals that glue fragments together or seal them beneath crusts. Roots reach down, burrowing creatures disturb what would otherwise have stayed in order. Even the act of discovery can be destructive if it is rushed. Archaeologists have learned, often through painful lessons, that a cave is not a container of objects so much as a fragile arrangement of relationships. The position of a bone matters. The depth of a hearth matters. The layer above a mark may matter as much as the mark itself. Context is the difference between a curiosity and a revelation. The earliest signs of presence may begin near the entrance, where daylight still reaches and the cave behaves like a shelter rather than an underworld. Here, ancient people or human relatives might have rested, butchered animals, repaired tools, or waited out storms. Stone flakes can reveal a hand striking one rock against another with practiced control. Burned bone may indicate food, warmth, or light. Pollen and plant remains may hint at seasons of use. Charcoal can hold the memory of fire long after the flame is gone. None of this is surprising by itself. Humans are practical animals, and caves offer practical advantages. But deeper inside, where the light thins and ordinary usefulness fades, the evidence begins to change character. A footprint in the dark is an especially intimate trace. Unlike a tool, it is not made to last. Unlike a bone, it is not left by death. It is the shape of a living moment. Someone places weight on damp ground, lifts the foot, and moves on. The print hardens or is covered quickly enough to survive. Tens of thousands of years later, it may still preserve the arch, the heel, the toes, sometimes even the slipping motion of a step taken carefully on wet clay. In some caves, trackways show adults and children moving together. In others, bare feet pass through passages where darkness would have been absolute without fire. Scholars still debate the meaning of many such journeys, but the physical fact is difficult to ignore. People entered, and they did so with enough purpose to risk the deep interior. The traces can also be stranger than footprints. In some caves, ancient visitors broke stalagmites or stalactites and arranged them in patterns that are not easily explained by natural collapse. In others, they pressed hands against walls and blew pigment around them, leaving negative images of fingers spread wide across stone. Sometimes the fingers are complete, sometimes they appear shortened, bent, hidden, or damaged, leading to debates about frostbite, ritual gestures, counting systems, or symbolic codes. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all examples. Yet the effect is powerful. A hand stencil is not a portrait, but it is a presence. It says that someone stood close enough to stone to leave the outline of a body, and that someone else may have understood the act. Even a mark that seems almost nothing can become important. A cross-hatched pattern engraved on stone, a cluster of dots, a red disc, a line placed where no line needs to be. These things are difficult because they hover between gesture and symbol. Animals can scratch walls, minerals can stain rock, firelight can trick the eye, but repeated forms, deliberate placement, prepared pigments, and association with other human activity change the balance of probability. What survives in the record suggests that ancient minds were not merely responding to immediate hunger. Some were making marks that carried meaning, though the meaning itself has mostly died. The cave's first human signs are often discovered through patient attention rather than drama. Sediment is removed slowly. Screens catch tiny fragments. Samples are bagged and labelled with a precision that would seem excessive, until one realizes how much depends on millimeters. A tooth might identify a species. A burned seed might reveal seasonality. A flake of stone might show that raw material came from far away, implying movement or exchange. A microscopic polish on an edge might show use on hide, wood, bone, or plant fibers. There is a quiet tension in this kind of work because every small thing might be ordinary, and every ordinary thing might be part of a pattern not yet visible. One surprising detail in many deep cave discoveries is how often absence becomes evidence. A chamber may contain no signs of long-term habitation, no heaps of food waste, no dense tool scatter, no repeated hearths, no practical debris of daily life. Yet it may contain marks, footprints, arranged materials, or remains placed in ways that suggest brief, intentional visits. This absence of ordinary living can make the traces more mysterious, not less. If people were not sleeping there, eating there, or making tools there, why enter? Why go beyond the entrance, beyond comfort, beyond the safe logic of shelter? The answer is rarely simple. It may involve ritual, exploration, teaching, social identity, memory, or behaviours that do not fit neatly into modern categories. Light is one of the hidden clues. To move deep into a cave, ancient people need a technology of darkness. Torches, lamps, or portable embers must be prepared, carried, and managed. Fuel must be gathered outside. Flames must be kept alive long enough to enter and return. Smoke must be tolerated. The path must be remembered. In some caves, soot marks on ceilings reveal repeated use of fire underground. Experimental archaeology shows that different lighting methods change what can be seen, how long people can stay, and how walls appear as shadows move. A painted or engraved surface may have looked alive under flickering flame, its curves and cracks shifting with movement. This does not prove ritual by itself, but it reminds us that the cave was experienced with the body, not studied under laboratory light. Then there are the bones. Human bones inside caves carry a special charge because they can represent death, accident, burial, predation, or later disturbance. A skull fragment may have been washed in. A skeleton may have fallen through a shaft. Bones may have been moved by animals or people. Cut marks, breakage patterns, positions, and sediment history all matter. When remains belong not to Homo sapiens but to another human relative, the questions multiply. Were they living there? Were they placed there? Did they die in the cave? Did others return to them? The answers can reshape assumptions about care, memory, and social life in extinct humans. But caution is essential. The dead are easy to overinterpret, especially when they are very old. The first traces in darkness therefore form a kind of threshold. They do not yet tell the whole story, but they change the terms of the investigation. A cave with animal bones is a paleontological site. A cave with tools near the entrance is an occupation site. But a cave with deliberate activity far from daylight becomes something more difficult and more revealing. It suggests that ancient humans, or human relatives, crossed from necessity into another kind of behaviour. They did not merely use the landscape. They entered it, marked it, remembered it, and perhaps transformed it. This is where the discovery begins to gather force. The cave is no longer passive scenery. It becomes an actor in the human past, shaping what could be done and what could be preserved. The dark protects fragile evidence, but it also demands intention from those who entered it. Every trace beyond the reach of daylight carries the same quiet question: what kind of mind decided to come here? The answer is not fully known. Scholars still debate the meanings, the makers, and the motives. But the old assumption that deep prehistory was simple grows weaker with every footprint, every mark, every ember stain, every bone found where it should not easily be. The first signs are small, and that is why they feel so haunting. They do not show a civilization in the later sense. They show something older than civilization, and perhaps more fundamental attention. Someone noticed the cave. Someone chose a path into it. Someone did something there that survived. In the long silence before writing, before cities, before the great monuments of history. A human or near-human presence moved through darkness and left behind just enough for the future to realize it had underestimated the past. The change does not happen all at once. A cave rarely becomes revolutionary in the instant someone first sees it. At the beginning, there is usually mud, equipment, poor light, awkward passages, and the ordinary discipline of fieldwork. Researchers crawl, map, measure, photograph, sample, and argue quietly over what belongs to which layer. A fragment is lifted, a wall is examined, A floor deposit is opened by a careful trench. Nothing about the first moments needs to feel world-changing. In fact, the most important discoveries often arrive disguised as routine, because science is not built to believe the extraordinary too quickly. It is built to resist it until the evidence leaves no easier place to stand. Then something begins to feel wrong in the best possible way. A mark appears beneath a mineral skin that should have taken immense time to form. A tool is found under deposits older than expected. A bone comes from a layer where it does not comfortably belong. A chamber thought to contain only animal traces reveals repeated human activity. The first reaction is not triumph. It is caution, contamination, disturbance, mistaken identification, and faulty dating all have to be considered. Archaeology has been misled before by mixed layers, intrusive burials, and beautiful coincidences. The cave must be treated almost like a witness whose memory is valuable but difficult, and whose testimony has to be checked from every angle. The moment of realization is therefore less like a door bursting open, and more like a series of locks turning one after another. A sample is taken from the mineral crust above a pigment mark, and another from beneath it. Sediment is analyzed. The position of surrounding stones is recorded. Photographs are compared with scans. Microscopic traces are studied to see whether a line is natural, animal-made, or deliberate. If bone is involved, its shape is compared with known human and animal remains. If DNA survives, it may reveal ancestry where anatomy alone is uncertain. Each test narrows the possibilities. Each result either weakens the claim or makes it harder to dismiss. This is the point where the cave begins to disturb the timeline. Perhaps the evidence suggests that a human relative entered deep darkness long before such behavior was expected. Perhaps the marks are older than the assumed arrival of modern humans in the region. Perhaps the remains belong to a population no one knew existed there. Perhaps the cave shows that symbolic behavior, planning, or social care emerged in more than one branch of the human family. No single discovery can carry every conclusion safely, and scholars still debate many details, but the pressure builds when different forms of evidence point in the same direction. A footprint alone may be ambiguous. A footprint with torches, marks, dates, and repeated activity becomes harder to explain away. There is a strange emotional restraint in these turning points. The public often imagines discovery as a shout, a dramatic announcement, a scientist holding up a relic while history rearranges itself. The real drama is quieter. It happens in the pause after a date comes back from a laboratory. It happens when a result is checked because it seems too old. It happens when another sample agrees. It happens when the team realizes the safest interpretation is no longer the familiar one. That is when excitement becomes almost uncomfortable. A claim that rewrites history is also a claim that invites attack, and rightly so. Extraordinary evidence must survive extraordinary scrutiny. One lesser-known but crucial part of this process is that the cave itself can protect and betray the evidence at the same time. Mineral crusts, especially calcite, conceal a mark and provide a minimum age, showing that whatever lies beneath must be older than the crust. This can be powerful, but it is not simple. Uranium series dating, radiocarbon dating, optically stimulated luminescence, paleomagnetic signals, sediment stratigraphy, and genetic methods all answer slightly different questions. A date may belong to the formation above an object, the sediment around it, the burning of charcoal nearby, or the death of an organism. The date is never just a number, it is a relationship. Misunderstand that relationship, and the whole story tilts. When researchers realize the cave contains evidence older or stranger than expected, They also inherit a burden of imagination, not fantasy, but disciplined imagination. They must reconstruct actions from traces that are partial and mute. If a broken stalagmite lies in a ring deep underground, they ask whether it fell naturally, was moved by water, disturbed by animals, or deliberately arranged. If pigment appears on a wall, they ask how it was made, how it reached that place, whether it was applied by hand, whether the surface was available at the proposed date, and whether later processes could have altered it. If remains are found in a hard-to-reach chamber, they ask whether bodies were placed there, fell there, washed there, or accumulated through some process no one has yet recognized. The evidence does not become less mysterious under scrutiny. It becomes more precise. At this stage, the discovery also begins to escape the cave. Specialists are drawn in, geologists, paleoanthropologists, dating experts, geneticists, taphonomists, cave scientists, and archaeologists each see a different layer of the problem. The cave becomes a meeting place of disciplines. This is where modern archaeology differs sharply from the treasure-hunting past. A single object is rarely enough. The surrounding sediment, microscopic residues, chemical signatures, ancient DNA, and formation history may all matter as much as the visible find. The old idea of discovery as possession gives way to discovery as interpretation. Still, there is a moment when interpretation becomes unavoidable. The results may indicate that a supposedly primitive human relative navigated darkness with light and purpose. They may show that art or symbolic marking did not begin where earlier models placed it. They may reveal that ancient populations moved through landscapes in ways not predicted by current maps. They may suggest that behavior once used as a dividing line between us and them was shared, borrowed, or independently developed. What survives in the record suggests not a sudden miracle, but a deeper complexity in the roots of human behavior. The public version of the discovery often arrives later, polished into headlines. That is when the phrase rewrites human history begins to appear, sometimes too eagerly. It can sound exaggerated, and sometimes it is. Not every surprising cave find overturns everything. Some adjust a date, some broaden a range, some complicate a model without destroying it. But occasionally, a cave discovery deserves the phrase because it forces scholars to redraw a boundary they had trusted for decades. The rewrite is not always a dramatic erasure. Often this is more unsettling a correction in the margins that eventually changes the whole page. The cave at the centre of this story belongs to that more powerful category. Its importance lies not only in what was found, but in what the find makes newly possible. If this behaviour happened here, at this time, by these people, then other evidence once dismissed may need to be reconsidered. Other caves may need to be re-examined. Old collections in museum drawers may hold pieces of the same puzzle, overlooked because earlier scholars did not yet know what they were looking for. A discovery underground can send a shock through archives, laboratories, and field sites across continents. And yet the turning point remains anchored in a simple human act. Someone in deep time entered a cave and left a trace. Thousands of years later, someone else noticed it and understood that it did not fit. Between those two moments lies an almost unbearable distance, filled with vanished climates, extinct animals, lost populations, and the entire rise of recorded history. The cave connects them without explanation. It gives the modern world a fragment and withholds the full story. That is why the discovery changes everything slowly. First it unsettles a researcher, then a team, then a model, then the wider story of human origins. The cave does not shout, It waits while people catch up. The more carefully the evidence is tested, the more serious the implications become. What seemed at first like an anomaly begins to look like a message from a broader, stranger past human history did not begin when writing began, or when cities rose, or even when Homo sapiens stood alone. It began in many places, in many forms, with minds moving through landscapes and darkness long before anyone was there to call it history. The evidence from a cave rarely arrives as a single perfect object. It comes as a collection of fragments, each one modest, each one stubborn, each one demanding to be understood in relation to the others. A bone by itself may be only a bone. A stone flake by itself may be only debris. A patch of darkened sediment may be only a stain. But when these things sit together in a layer sealed by time, when their positions repeat a pattern, when their surfaces carry marks that nature struggles to explain, the silence of the cave begins to thicken into testimony. It is not a confession. It is not a story told cleanly. It is more like a room full of witnesses who have forgotten most of the event, but still remember where they were standing. The bones are often the first to attract attention, partly because they look most familiar to the human eye, and partly because death has a directness that stone does not. In a cave connected to deep human history, bone can belong to many kinds of beings: hunted animals, scavenged animals, predators, cave bears, rodents, birds, and sometimes humans or human relatives themselves. The first task is separation. Which bones were brought in by carnivores, which were washed in by water, which belong to animals that died naturally in the cave, which show signs of butchery, burning, deliberate placement, or later disturbance. The answers are rarely obvious. A cave can be a shelter, a den, a trap, a tomb, and a sediment basin at different times, sometimes all within the same long sequence. Cut marks on bone can reveal contact with stone tools, but even there, caution rules. A thin line may result from butchery, trampling, root etching, or abrasion. Under magnification, however, deliberate cuts often show particular shapes, angles, and internal striations. Breakage patterns can reveal whether a bone was cracked while fresh, perhaps to extract marrow, or broken long after it dried. Burned bone may suggest cooking, warmth, waste disposal, or accidental exposure to fire. If a human group repeatedly uses the cave entrance as a campsite, the bones may accumulate like the leftovers of survival. If bones appear deep inside, far from ordinary living space, their meaning becomes less straightforward. Human remains are more unsettling. A tooth can identify an ancient population more securely than a dramatic-looking skull fragment, because teeth preserve well and carry distinctive shapes. A finger bone, a jaw, a skull piece, a femur shaft, or even sediment containing genetic traces can reveal who passed through or died there. Sometimes the remains are isolated, as if scattered by geology or animals. Sometimes they are grouped in ways that suggest deposition. The evidence remains incomplete in many famous cases, and scholars still debate whether certain accumulations reflect burial, body disposal, accident, predation, or unknown practices. But even uncertainty matters. The possibility that extinct human relatives may have handled the dead with intention does not fit the older picture of them as merely practical creatures. Stone is quieter but often more reliable. Stone tools survive where wood, fibre, hide, and most plant materials disappear. A flake struck from a core preserves the physics of a decision. Its bulb of percussion, platform, scars, edge damage, and raw material can show that it was not just broken rock, it was made. Some tools are simple, others astonishingly refined. But even a basic flake carries knowledge the maker understood fracture, angle, force, and material in a cave. Stone can reveal whether people used local rock gathered nearby or transported better material across distance. That detail matters because movement of stone implies movement through landscape, planning ahead, or contact between places. A small flint edge can contain the geography of a vanished life. Yet not all cave evidence is portable. Some of it belongs to the cave itself. Walls, ceilings, floors, and mineral formations can be altered in ways that become central to the discovery. Finger tracings in soft surfaces, engraved lines, pigment marks, soot stains, broken stalagmites, smoothed areas, and intentionally placed stones all expand the meaning of human activity beyond tools and food. In deep chambers, such traces are especially important because they are not easily explained as the debris of daily living. A group does not accidentally carry flame hundreds of meters underground and leave repeated marks in difficult places without some kind of purpose. What that purpose was remains uncertain, but the action is already meaningful. Sediment is the great overlooked witness. To a casual observer, cave floor deposits may look like dirt. To a specialist, they are layered archives of climate, occupation, collapse, water flow, ash, pollen, dust, animal activity, and chemical change. Thin sections of sediment, viewed under microscopes, can reveal ash particles, crushed bone, phytoliths from plants, dung, mineral crystals, and trampling surfaces. Ancient DNA can sometimes be extracted from sediment even when no visible bone remains, allowing researchers to detect humans, animals, or changing ecosystems from the dirt itself. This is one of the more surprising developments in recent archaeology. A cave may preserve a genetic shadow of presence after the body has vanished completely. Surfaces also matter. A floor hardened by minerals can preserve footprints, knees, hands, dragged objects, or the repeated passage of bodies. The difference between a random depression and a footprint can be subtle, but track specialists look for pressure patterns, toe marks, stride length, depth, and sequence. In some caves, the tracks of children appear beside those of adults, complicating any simple idea that deep cave visits were only the work of specialized ritual figures or hunters. Children in the dark suggest teaching, social inclusion, exploration, or something else that modern categories cannot easily hold. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the presence of young feet gives the ancient scene a startling human immediacy. Fire leaves its own archive. Hearths near cave mouths can be dense with charcoal, ash, burned stone, and food remains. Deeper inside, fire may appear as soot on ceilings, charcoal fragments, torch wipes, burned resin, or scattered remains of lighting. These traces can show not just that people had fire, but that they managed it in places where losing light could be fatal. A torch is a tool of movement. A lamp is a tool of staying. The kind of light used affects the kind of activity possible. Flickering flame on uneven walls can make natural shapes appear animated, while a small lamp may create a pool of visibility just large enough for careful work. The cave's darkness is not empty background. It is a condition that ancient visitors had to solve. Then there are the hidden surfaces, the parts of the cave that earlier generations of researchers might have missed. Modern scanning can reveal engravings too shallow to see under normal light. Chemical imaging can distinguish pigment from mineral stain. Three-dimensional mapping can show how a chamber would have been navigated and which panels were visible from which positions. Sometimes a mark once dismissed as random becomes part of a larger composition. Sometimes a celebrated image turns out to be less secure than hoped. The process cuts both ways. Better methods do not simply confirm mystery, they also remove false certainty. That is what makes them valuable. The most compelling cave discoveries are built from convergence. Bones suggest presence, tools suggest activity, sediments preserve context, dates establish age, wall marks imply intention, fire traces show access to darkness, genetic evidence identifies populations. None of these alone is immune to challenge. Together, they can become difficult to avoid. The cave begins to look less like a place where one odd thing happened and more like a preserved intersection of bodies, skills, environments, and choices. Still, the silence remains. The evidence can show that ancient people entered, made, marked, burned, carried, placed, or returned. It cannot easily show what they believed, feared, remembered, or hoped. A ring of stones may be practical, symbolic, playful, or connected to acts whose meaning has no modern equivalent. A bone deposit may reflect care, disposal, danger, or a cultural practice beyond recovery. A painted shape may mark identity, territory, myth, teaching, or nothing so formal. Scholars still debate these boundaries because the cave gives matter, not motive. That is why bones, stone, and silence belong together. Bone brings the body into the story, stone brings the hand, sediment brings time, fire brings movement, marks bring attention, silence brings humility. The cave discovery becomes powerful not because it answers every question, but because it forces better questions. It asks how much intelligence can be recognized from fragments. It asks whether symbolic behavior must look like later art to count. It asks whether extinct humans were less like us, or whether we have been too eager to make ourselves exceptional. By the time the evidence is assembled, the cave is no longer a mysterious hollow beneath the earth. It is a record of contact between mind and landscape. Every fragment carries the weight of survival, chance, and interpretation. The ancient visitors remain nameless, but they are not absent. They are present in the chipped edge, the darkened ceiling, the pressed footprint, the broken mineral, the tooth in the sediment, the mark sealed beneath stone. They do not explain themselves. They do something more unsettling. They endure. The cave does not become ancient because it feels ancient. It becomes ancient because time is measured against it, tested from several directions, and forced into numbers that can be argued over. This is where the mystery leaves the realm of atmosphere and enters the colder world of laboratories, half-lives, error ranges, and contamination controls. A chamber may look primordial, a wall may seem untouched, a bone may appear to belong to a vanished world. But archaeology cannot survive on impressions. It needs dates. Without them, the cave is only strange. With them, it may become impossible to place inside the old story. Dating a cave discovery is rarely a matter of simply asking how old the object is. Sometimes the object itself can be dated, but often it cannot. A stone tool contains no organic carbon. A pigment may lack datable material. A footprint is a shape in sediment, not a clock. A broken stalagmite may be older than the human act that moved it, while a mineral crust above it may be younger. The real question becomes more careful: what is the age of the layer around the find? The material above it, the material below it, the last time nearby sediments or sunlight, the moment charcoal stopped being alive, or the period when calcite sealed the surface. Each answer is partial. Together, they build a bracket around the event. Radiocarbon dating is the most famous method, but its power has limits. It works on once-living material, such as charcoal, bone collagen, shell, or plant remains, and it reaches only so far back with confidence. For much of the deep human past, especially beyond roughly 50,000 years, radiocarbon becomes less useful, and even within its range contamination can mislead. A tiny intrusion of younger carbon can make something look far more recent than it is. Old carbon in certain environments can create the opposite problem. This is why careful pre-treatment, multiple samples, and context matter so much. A dramatic date from a single fragment is not enough to rewrite anything safely. Caves often require other clocks. Uranium series dating can measure the formation of calcium carbonate deposits, the pale crusts and flowstones that grow as mineral-rich water moves through limestone. If a thin calcite skin lies over a painted mark, the crust provides a minimum age the mark must be older than the mineral that covered it. If deposits beneath the mark can also be dated, they may provide a maximum age. This is a powerful approach, especially for cave art or altered surfaces, but it has its own difficulties. Uranium can move through systems in complicated ways. Samples may be tiny. The relationship between the dated crust and the human action must be clear. Scholars still debate some results not because dating science is useless, but because the cave's geology is complicated enough to demand caution. Another method, optically stimulated luminescence, asks when mineral grains in sediment last saw daylight. Quartz or feldspar grains store energy from natural radiation over time. Exposure to sunlight resets that signal, and burial begins the clock again. In a cave, this can help date sediments that buried tools, bones, or footprints. But the method depends on whether the grains were fully exposed to light before deposition, whether they were later disturbed, and how the radiation environment changed. A cave floor is not a sealed laboratory. Water, animals, collapse, and human activity can all disturb layers. The evidence remains incomplete unless dating is woven tightly into stratigraphy, geology, and excavation records. Sometimes the cave offers paleomagnetic clues, fossil animals, pollen sequences, volcanic ash, or climate markers that help place layers within broader timeframes. Sometimes DNA adds another kind of clock, using genetic divergence to estimate relationships and population histories. Each method has strengths, each has weaknesses. The strongest cases do not depend on one dazzling number, but on convergence. A claim becomes harder to dismiss when mineral dates, sediment dates, stratigraphy, tool styles, faunal remains, and genetic signals all point toward the same deep period. This is also where the word impossible needs to be handled carefully. In science, an impossible date usually means one of two things. Either the evidence is wrong or the model is wrong. The first possibility must always be tested ruthlessly. Layers may be mixed, samples may be contaminated, objects may have moved. A cave wall may have been altered later than assumed. A bone may have slipped down through a crack. A footprint-like hollow may not be a footprint at all. Extraordinary claims often fail at this stage, and they should. The past is strange enough without forcing it to carry weak evidence. But sometimes the date survives. It is checked, repeated, challenged, narrowed, and still refuses to become ordinary. That is when the second possibility grows stronger. The model was too simple. Perhaps modern humans reached an area earlier than thought. Perhaps Neanderthals or another human relative made marks, structures, or choices once denied to them. Perhaps symbolic behavior appeared in separate populations, or had roots deeper than expected. Perhaps migrations were not clean waves but pulses, retreats, mixtures, and failed expansions. The cave does not announce which model must replace the old one, but it damages the old confidence. One lesser-known part of dating is the importance of error ranges. A date is not a pinpoint placed neatly on a timeline. It is usually a range, shaped by measurement uncertainty, calibration, sample quality, and assumptions about the system. A result may indicate that something is at least a certain age, not exactly that age. A layer may date to a broad window in which multiple human populations could have been present. This matters because public retellings often flatten uncertainty into a headline. The careful scientific statement may be that a mark is older than a mineral crust that formed within a certain range. The simplified version becomes that a particular species definitely made art at a precise date. The difference is not pedantic. It is the difference between evidence and exaggeration. The cave discovery that rewrites history must pass through this narrow gate. Its dates must do more than impress. They must survive geology. They must survive contamination. They must survive comparison with other sites. They must survive alternative explanations. If a date suggests that a chamber was used before Homo sapiens are known in that region, the claim immediately raises the question of who else was there. If a date places symbolic marks far earlier than expected, researchers must ask whether the marks are truly human-made, whether the dating samples directly relate to them, and whether later disturbance is possible. This is not skepticism for its own sake. It is how fragile truth becomes strong enough to bear weight. Dating also changes the emotional scale of the cave. 1,000 years already feels vast from the perspective of one life. 10,000 years reaches beyond the rise of farming in many regions. 40,000 years moves into the Ice Age world of mammoths, Neanderthals, early modern humans, and vanished coastlines. 100,000 years and more enters a deep human past where species boundaries, migrations, and behaviors become harder to see but more important. To place a mark, a footprint, or a bone into that depth is to tear open the present. It reminds us that most of the human story took place before history had any way to remember itself. And yet the dates alone do not make meaning. A number can shock, but it cannot explain why someone entered the cave, what they did there, or how they understood the act. That is the paradox. Dating can prove that the trace is older than expected, but the older it becomes, the fewer interpretive anchors remain. The cave grows more important and more silent at the same time. No written culture waits nearby to clarify it. No oral tradition survives across such depth intact. The date gives the discovery authority, but also loneliness. Still, when the results hold, they change the map of possibility. A cave once treated as a local site becomes part of a continental or even global argument. Timelines of migration are adjusted. The abilities of extinct humans are reconsidered. Museum specimens are re-examined. Other caves, once thought unremarkable, become candidates for new testing. The discovery does not simply add one old thing to the record. It changes what researchers are willing to look for. That may be the deepest effect of dating the impossible. It alters expectation. Before the date, a mark may be dismissed because it seems too simple or too early. After the date, simplicity itself becomes evidence that ancient behavior does not always announce itself in grand forms. Before the date, a deep chamber may look irrelevant because no one imagined early humans using it. After the date, darkness becomes part of the story. Before the date, a human relative may seem incapable. After the date, incapability becomes the assumption that needs defending. The cave remains stone, sediment, and silence. But the clocks hidden inside it keep working long after the last torch goes out. They measure drops of mineral water, buried grains, dying embers, sealed bones, and the slow patience of the earth. When those clocks are read correctly, they can do something more unsettling than reveal age. They can reveal that history has been too young in its imagination. The deeper the cave goes, the less useful ordinary explanations become. Near the entrance, life is understandable in simple terms: shelter from rain, shade from heat, protection from wind, a place to butcher meat, repair tools, sleep lightly, or wait for animals to pass through the valley below. But far inside, where daylight cannot reach, and every step depends on carried flame, the cave becomes something else. It stops being merely useful. It becomes chosen. That choice is the heart of the mystery. To enter deep darkness is to accept risk. A torch can fail. Smoke can gather under low ceilings. A wrong turn can turn confidence into panic. Wet clay can take a footprint, but it can also take balance. Passages narrow, drop, twist, and echo. A person moving through them must remember the path back, or trust someone who does. This is not the behavior of a creature merely reacting to hunger. It requires planning, cooperation, and a mental map of unseen space. Even before a mark is made, the journey itself says something about the mind that undertakes it. In some caves, the evidence suggests repeated visits into places that offer no obvious practical reward. There are no rich food remains, no comfortable living floors, no signs that people stayed long enough to make the deep chambers ordinary camps. Instead, there are marks on walls, broken formations, charcoal traces, footprints, pigment, or arranged materials. Scholars still debate what these traces mean, but they keep returning to one difficult possibility: some ancient humans, or human relatives, and were doing things underground that belong to memory, identity, teaching, ritual, or imagination. The word ritual must be used carefully. It is tempting, and therefore dangerous. When archaeologists cannot explain something easily, ritual can become a soft container for uncertainty. Yet the danger of overusing the word does not mean that symbolic behavior never existed. Modern humans do not enter dark places only for food or shelter. They mark them, fear them, sanctify them, explore them, test themselves in them, and turn them into thresholds. It would be strange to assume that ancient minds, especially minds already capable of tool-making, social learning, fire management, and long survival in difficult landscapes, had no layered relationship with darkness at all. The evidence remains incomplete, but the cave keeps suggesting that practical survival was not the whole story. Hands are among the most powerful signs of that deeper relationship. A hand pressed to stone is an ordinary gesture made extraordinary by time. It is not a full image of a person, but it is personal in a way many ancient objects are not. A stone tool shows intelligence. A hand stencil shows presence. Fingers spread against a cave wall collapse the distance between the living body and the rock surface. Pigment blown around the hand leaves absence as a shape. The person is gone, and the missing hand remains. Some hand images appear in places that require effort to reach. Some are high, low, tucked into recesses, or placed on surfaces that interact with natural contours of the cave. Their meaning is lost. They may relate to identity, belonging, storytelling, initiation, play, counting, memory, or something no modern category preserves. No single explanation fully accounts for them across all caves and periods, but they show that the body itself could become a sign. Long before writing fixes names into marks, the hand becomes a kind of declaration someone was here, and the wall was made to remember. Other traces are less immediately human to the eye, but no less important. Lines scratched into soft surfaces, dots of pigment, geometric forms, and repeated marks challenge the older belief that symbolic thought must look like recognizable animals or elaborate scenes. A red disc may not impress a museum visitor in the way a painted bison does, but if it is deliberate, ancient, and placed deep within a cave, it matters profoundly. Symbolic behavior does not begin only when art becomes beautiful to modern observers. It may begin with attention, repetition, selection, and the decision to make a mark that outlasts the moment. This is where discoveries associated with extinct human relatives become so disruptive. For generations, Neanderthals in particular were treated as strong, cold-adapted, skilled, but limited. Their tools were respected, their endurance acknowledged, yet their inner lives were often imagined as dimmer than those of Homo sapiens. That picture has changed under pressure from many kinds of evidence pigments, ornaments, possible burials, complex hunting, care for injured individuals, and signs of activity in challenging environments. Scholars still argue over particular cases, and some claims are stronger than others, but the broad trend is clear. The gap once drawn between modern minds and other human minds is no longer easy to defend. A cave discovery that places deliberate activity deep underground before or outside the expected presence of Homo sapiens strikes directly at that gap. It does not prove that every extinct human group had the same symbolic world as ours. It does not make Neanderthals or Denisovans simply identical to modern humans in every respect. Evolution rarely works so neatly. But it forces a more interesting possibility. Intelligence in the human family may have been plural. Different groups may have possessed different strengths, traditions, and ways of understanding place. Some capacities once imagined as uniquely ours may have older roots, shared roots, or parallel expressions. Planning is one of those capacities. Entering a cave requires more than courage. It requires preparation. Fuel must be gathered, light must be made portable, the group must decide who goes in and who remains outside. If children are present, the act becomes even more complex. Their footprints in some cave systems suggest that deep spaces were not always restricted to a single adult specialist. Young people may have watched, learned, followed, played, or participated. The image is startling because it brings social life into the darkness. The cave is not just an archaeological location, it becomes a place where knowledge passes between bodies. The management of fire also reveals a quiet sophistication. Fire is not simply possessed, it is maintained. A torch burns down, a lamp needs fuel, smoke reveals airflow or the lack of it. In deep chambers, light determines the size of the visible world. Ancient visitors may have known how long a torch would last, where to pause, when to relight, how to avoid losing the way. Experimental work shows that moving through caves with prehistoric lighting is demanding, but not chaotic when done by skilled people. The darkness does not prove mysticism, but it does prove competence. There is also the matter of sound. Caves are acoustic spaces. A whisper can travel strangely. Footsteps multiply. Water drops become rhythms. Chambers can amplify voice, breath, or movement. Some researchers have explored whether ancient marks cluster in places with unusual echoes, though such claims must be treated cautiously. The idea is not proven everywhere, and the evidence varies. Still, it adds another layer to the experience. The cave was not only seen by firelight, it was heard, felt, smelled, and navigated through the whole body. Ancient people did not encounter stone as a diagram. They encountered it as an environment alive with sensation. The surprising detail is that deep cave behavior may have been both extraordinary and familiar to those who practiced it. To modern observers, entering such spaces can feel like an expedition into another world. For people who knew the landscape intimately, a cave might have been frightening, meaningful, useful, and known all at once. They may have returned to particular chambers across generations. They may have taught roots as part of local knowledge. They may have recognized certain walls, formations, or echoes the way later people recognize landmarks above ground. What seems mysterious from the outside may have been embedded in ordinary cultural memory, yet the cave still resists full explanation. A mark does not tell us whether it was made during fear, celebration, grief, instruction, boredom, or reverence. A broken formation does not say whether it was arranged for structure, sign, game, or ceremony. A footprint does not reveal the thought passing through the person who left it. The evidence can carry us to the edge of ancient behavior, but not fully into ancient consciousness. That boundary is frustrating, and it is necessary. Without it, imagination becomes fiction disguised as certainty. What the cave does show is enough. It shows that the dark was not empty to ancient minds. It shows that some people, perhaps including people not quite like us, could plan beyond immediate need, move through difficult hidden spaces, leave deliberate traces, and perhaps attach meaning to places where survival alone gives no easy reason to go. It shows hands in the deep, not as symbols of conquest, but as signs of relationship, between body and stone, between memory and place, between the living and the long silence waiting to receive them. This is the point where the discovery begins to rewrite not only dates, but dignity. It asks whether the ancient beings we've placed below ourselves were actually standing closer than we thought, holding fire in one hand and touching stone with the other. It asks whether humanity is best understood not as a sudden arrival of brilliance, but as a long, uneven widening of attention. The cave does not give us their words. It gives us their choices. And in the deep past, a choice to enter darkness and leave a sign may be one of the oldest forms of history there is. The question of who entered the cave is more difficult than it first appears. It would be comforting if every ancient trace came with a maker's name attached, or at least with a complete skeleton resting nearby in perfect context. But deep history is not generous in that way. It offers fragments, distances, overlaps, and probabilities. A mark on a wall may be older than the known arrival of one population but younger than another. A tooth may identify a lineage without explaining what that lineage did in the chamber. A tool style may suggest a maker, but traditions can spread, change, or be shared. The cave forces the most basic question of all and then refuses to answer it cleanly: who were the people before the people? For a long time, the answer seemed simpler than it does now. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, were treated as the main authors of symbolic behavior, complex imagination, and meaningful marking. Other human relatives stood nearby in the story, but often in shadow. Neanderthals became the strong cousins of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Impressive, but supposedly limited. Denisovans remained almost ghost-like, known first from tiny bones and teeth in a Siberian cave, then from DNA carried by people living thousands of kilometers away. Older human forms were placed still deeper in time, important for ancestry but rarely invited into discussions of inner life. The caste was known, or so it seemed. The roles were assigned. Then the evidence began to complicate the play. Neanderthals were not brutish placeholders waiting to be replaced. They made sophisticated tools, hunted dangerous animals, cared for injured members of their groups, used fire, occupied difficult environments, and in some cases appear associated with pigments, ornaments, and possible burials. Denisovans, though physically elusive, left genetic traces that suggest wide dispersal and adaptation, including influence in high-altitude survival among later humans. Homo sapiens themselves emerged not as a sudden finished product in one small corner, but from a deep African background of shifting populations. The more evidence accumulates, the more the human family looks less like a ladder and more like a braided river, splitting, merging, vanishing underground, and reappearing when no one expected it. The cave discovery sits inside that braided story. If the traces are old enough, their maker may not be Homo sapiens at all. If they are in a region where Neanderthals lived before modern humans arrived, then Neanderthals become serious candidates. If the cave lies farther east, or if ancient DNA points in that direction, Denisovans or related populations may enter the discussion. If the date is deeper still, the maker may belong to a lineage that has no familiar name, known only through a few bones or through genetic echoes. Scholars still debate these identifications because species boundaries in human evolution are not clean walls. They are porous, shifting, and sometimes visible only after the fact. Bones help, but they rarely solve everything. A skull can reveal a great deal, yet skulls are not always found with the marks or structures that matter most. Teeth preserve well and can be highly diagnostic, but a tooth in one layer does not automatically assign every nearby action to its owner. A fragment of finger bone can transform the story of a whole population, as happened with Denisovans. But it can also remind us how little anatomy may survive from people who once occupied enormous landscapes. Ancient DNA has become one of the most powerful tools in this search, but DNA preservation depends on temperature, chemistry, age, and chance. Many caves contain no usable genetic material at all. Others preserve DNA in sediment, creating a ghostly record of presence without bodies. That is astonishing, but it also demands careful interpretation. Presence in a cave system does not always equal authorship of every trace inside it. Tool traditions create another layer of uncertainty. Archaeologists once leaned heavily on stone tool industries to identify populations. Certain toolkits were associated with Neanderthals, others with modern humans, and so on. This remains useful, but it is no longer simple. Tools are learned behaviors, not biological labels. Different groups may make similar tools under similar pressures. One group may adopt or adapt techniques from another. A population may change its toolkit over time. The evidence remains incomplete, and tool style alone cannot carry the full burden of identity. A stone point is not a passport. The most unsettling possibility is that some behaviors may not belong neatly to one human species. Symbolic marking, careful treatment of the dead, deep cave exploration, ornament use, or pigment preparation may have emerged in different ways among different groups. They may have been inherited from a common ancestor, invented independently, or shared through contact. Ancient humans did not live as isolated textbook categories. In some places and periods, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other groups overlapped. Genetic evidence shows that at least some of them interbred. This means encounters happened, bodies met, children were born. Knowledge may have moved too, although proving cultural exchange is far harder than proving genetic exchange. The phrase people before the people is therefore misleading and useful at the same time. Misleading, because Neanderthals and Denisovans were people in the broader human sense social, intelligent, adaptive, and deeply rooted in their worlds, useful because they came before the world in which Homo sapiens stood alone. They belong to a crowded humanity, one that later narrowed into a single surviving branch. The cave lets us glimpse that earlier crowd. It does not show them as failed versions of us. It shows them as participants in a long experiment of being human. One surprising detail is how recent that crowded world is. Neanderthals survived until roughly the period when modern humans were spreading widely across Europe. Denisovan ancestry remains in living people today, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia, even though Denisovan fossils remain rare. These are not remote abstractions from a completely separate planet. They are close enough that their genetic legacy still moves through human bodies. The vanished are not entirely vanished. Some part of them crossed into the future through contact, mixture, and descent. Yet DNA can create a strange imbalance in the imagination. Because genes survive in fragments and can be measured, they may seem more real than culture, memory, or meaning. But a person is not only ancestry. The ancient visitors to the cave had learned behaviors, sounds, gestures, social bonds, routes through landscapes, and perhaps stories or practices that cannot be recovered from genomes. A Denisovan gene can survive where a Denisovan song cannot. A Neanderthal bone can remain where a Neanderthal memory disappears. The cave preserves matter, but it points toward lives richer than matter. If extinct humans made the cave traces, the consequences are profound. It would mean that capacities once used to define Homo sapiens were distributed more widely. It would suggest that imagination did not appear suddenly like a torch lit in one species, but may have glimmered across the human family in varied forms. It would also force a moral adjustment in how the past is told. Extinction has a way of making vanished beings seem lesser, as though disappearance proves inferiority. But extinction is not a verdict of worth. It can result from climate stress, small populations, disease, competition, absorption, bad luck, or many pressures together. No single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of other human groups, and their absence today should not be mistaken for simplicity in life. If Homo sapiens made the traces, the discovery can still rewrite history. It may push back arrival dates, reveal unexpected routes, show earlier symbolic behavior, or demonstrate that modern humans adapted to darkness, landscape, and ritualized spaces sooner than assumed. It may show that cultural complexity developed unevenly, appearing in one region, fading, transforming, or leaving only scattered signs. It may show that the story of our species was not a clean expansion of superior minds, but a series of fragile movements through worlds already inhabited by others. The cave itself may not choose between these possibilities. It may hold evidence of more than one population across time. A chamber visited by Neanderthals could later be entered by Homo sapiens. A site associated with one group in one layer may tell a different story in another. Later visitors may unknowingly step over older traces, disturb them, or add new marks. This layered use makes caves powerful and treacherous. They preserve contact not only between humans and stone, but between different times of human presence. The past does not lie flat, it overlaps. The search for the maker is ultimately a search for kinship, not sentimental kinship, but evolutionary and behavioral kinship. How far does the circle of human-like thought extend which ancient beings planned, remembered, marked, mourned, taught, explored, or imagined? Which of those abilities are visible archaeologically and which have left no trace at all? The cave cannot answer every question, but it widens the circle of suspicion. It makes it harder to assume that only beings exactly like us could do meaningful things. By the time the evidence is weighed, the who may remain unresolved. That uncertainty can feel disappointing, but it is also honest. The cave discovery rewrites history partly because it refuses the old certainty that the answer must be simple. The ancient world was full of humans, near humans, cousins, ancestors, hybrids, neighbours, and strangers. Some left bones, some left genes, some left tools. Some may have left marks in darkness. The fact that we cannot always separate them cleanly is not a failure of the story. It may be the story. So the people before the people stand at the edge of the torchlight. They are not monsters, not missing links, not crude drafts of ourselves. They are vanished relatives whose lives touch stone, fire, animals, weather, and one another. Whether the cave was entered by Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, or another population, it belongs to that larger humanity before history narrowed. It reminds us that the past was not waiting for us alone. It was already inhabited by minds, hands, choices, and silences, many of which disappeared so completely that only a cave could hold their outline. Once the cave has given up enough evidence to suggest who may have entered it, the next question spreads outward. No ancient person arrives in darkness from nowhere. Every footprint inside the cave begins somewhere outside it. Every stone tool has a source. Every pigment has a geology. Every human bone belongs to a body shaped by ancestry, movement, food, climate, and contact with others. The cave may be sealed and still, but the discovery inside it opens onto a moving map. And that map is one of the first things it begins to rewrite. For a long time, maps of ancient human migration looked cleaner than the reality they tried to describe. Arrows swept across continents. Populations appeared to leave one region, enter another, replace what came before, and move onward with the confidence of ink on paper. These maps were useful, but they could make the past seem too orderly. The real movement of ancient humans was almost certainly messier. Groups advanced, retreated, split, merged, disappeared, returned, and adapted to landscapes that changed beneath them. Some expansions failed, some left no descendants, some left only small genetic traces. Some may be known from a single cave because every open-air camp they used has been erased. A cave discovery can disrupt these maps because caves preserve ancient presence in places where models did not expect it. A dated tool layer may suggest that humans reached a region earlier than once believed. A tooth may reveal a population far from its assumed range. Sediment DNA may show that different human groups occupied the same cave at different times, turning one location into a hidden crossroads. Pigment or symbolic marks may indicate that ideas, not just bodies, moved across landscapes. What survives in the record suggests that migration was not only a matter of feet crossing ground, it was also knowledge crossing generations. The cave's location matters intensely. If it lies near a mountain pass, it may record movement through a corridor between worlds. If it sits above a river valley, it may mark a route followed by animals and hunters alike. If it overlooks a now drowned plain, it may preserve the inland edge of a lost coastal world. If it is found in a desert, it may belong to a period when that desert was green, watered, and alive with roots now unimaginable. Modern geography can mislead because ancient geography was often different. Seas rose, ice sheets opened and closed paths, lakes appeared and vanished, forests shifted into grasslands, and grasslands hardened into dust. This is why a cave can redraw not only a migration route, but the landscape itself, a site that looks isolated today, may once have stood beside a rich wetland. A cave high above a valley may once have been close to animal trails, water sources, or seasonal camps. A remote chamber may be only the surviving piece of a wider network of places now lost. The evidence remains incomplete, but every well-dated cave discovery becomes a fixed point against which vanished worlds can be reconstructed. It says someone was here, then, and from that point, every surrounding assumption must be tested. The movement of raw materials often gives the map its hidden lines. If a stone tool inside the cave is made from rock that outcrops many kilometers away, the ancient visitors either travelled across that distance, carried objects through seasonal routes, or obtained material through contact with others. If pigment came from a particular mineral source, it too may mark movement or selection. These details can seem small, but they reveal planning beyond the immediate cave. The people who entered did not live only at the entrance. They belonged to a wider territory remembered through paths, resources, dangers, and returns. Genetics has made this map even stranger. Ancient DNA shows that populations once imagined as separate often met and mixed. Modern humans carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry outside Africa. Some populations carry Denisovan ancestry. Other genetic signals hint at ghost populations, groups not yet clearly matched to fossils but present in the inheritance of later people. This means that migration was not simply replacement. It could involve encounter, absorption, conflict, cooperation, avoidance, and intimacy. No single explanation fully accounts for how all these interactions unfolded. But the genetic record has ended the fantasy of sealed human categories, moving across a blank world. The cave, in this larger story, becomes a pin driven into deep time. Around it, roots begin to bend. If Neanderthals made the marks, then their behavioral world extended farther than older models allowed. If Homo sapiens made them earlier than expected, then their expansion reached that region sooner, or through routes not yet fully documented. If Denisovans or another population were involved, then the map becomes even more open, because their known physical record is so sparse compared with their genetic importance. In each case, the cave does not merely add a site, it changes the possible shape of movement. One lesser-known complication is that ancient humans may have followed routes now underwater. During colder periods as sea levels were lower, exposing continental shelves, coastal plains, islands connected by land, and river systems that later drowned. Many early migrations may have hugged coastlines rich in food, only for the archaeological evidence to vanish beneath rising seas. This means inland caves can sometimes become the best surviving witnesses to movements that were partly coastal. The absence of evidence along modern shores may not mean people were absent. It may mean the old shore is now underwater, silent beneath waves. The cave may also show that migration was seasonal rather than permanent. A group could use a region during certain months, following herds, plant foods, or weather windows, and leave little evidence elsewhere. Footprints, hearths, or animal remains can sometimes hint at seasonality, though this is difficult and often debated. A cave used briefly but repeatedly over generations may look sparse compared with a settlement, yet it may have been part of a deeply familiar annual round. Ancient maps were not drawn as borders, they were lived as rhythms. As the map changes, so does the meaning of isolation. A cave deep in a rugged region may seem cut off to modern eyes, but prehistoric people often moved through difficult terrain with skill that settled agricultural societies later lost. Mountain corridors, river valleys, steppe edges, and coastal shelves could connect worlds. At the same time, climate shifts could isolate groups suddenly, trapping populations in refuges or forcing them into contact with others. The cave may record one moment in this pulse, an expansion during warmth, a retreat during cold, a refuge during drought, or a crossing during environmental opportunity. The discovery, therefore, challenges the idea of a single centre from which humanity simply radiated. Human origins and movements appear increasingly braided, regional, and layered. Africa remains central to the emergence of Homo sapiens. But even within Africa, the story involves multiple populations and shifting connections. Eurasia was not an empty stage, but a continent of established human relatives. Islands, highlands, deserts, forests, and coasts all shaped who moved where and when. A cave discovery that pushes presence deeper into one of these regions can force researchers to reconsider the timing of contact, the routes of expansion, and the cultural capacities carried along the way. Yet there is a caution here. One cave cannot become the whole map. A single old date does not prove a vast migration. A single artifact does not establish a continent-wide culture. A single genetic trace does not explain the lives of entire peoples. Scholars still debate how to connect isolated discoveries without turning them into overconfident stories. The strongest reconstructions are built from multiple sites, multiple methods, and a willingness to revise. The cave is a clue, not a final atlas. Still, some clues are large enough to move mountains on paper. Once the cave is accepted as evidence of ancient presence, it becomes impossible to draw the old map exactly as before. The arrows must become less certain. The blank spaces must become less blank. The boundaries between species, cultures, and regions must become more porous. The cave teaches that ancient humans did not move through the world as symbols on a diagram. They moved as families, bands, hunters, children, elders, strangers, and relatives, each carrying knowledge of terrain that no mapmaker recorded. Inside the cave, the evidence may be small. Outside it, the consequences spread across continents. A footprint in clay becomes a question about migration. A mineral-sealed mark becomes a challenge to arrival dates. A tooth becomes a population. A stone flake becomes a route. The underground chamber, once hidden from daylight, begins to redraw the ancient world above it. And in that redrawn world, humanity appears less like a conquest and more like a long negotiation with landscape. People moved when climates opened doors and stopped when climates closed them. They followed animals and water, but also memory. They entered territories already known to others. They met relatives whose names are lost. They carried skills into darkness and left signs behind. The cave does not show the whole journey, but it fixes one point so firmly that the journey around it must change. The map has been rewritten underground. Beyond the cave mouth, the world keeps changing. That is the first pressure that must be remembered. Ancient humans did not live against a stable background. They lived on a restless planet, beneath climates that could swing from warmth to cold, from wetness to drought, from open grassland to forest and back again. The cave may seem permanent, and compared with a human life it nearly is. But the world outside its entrance could transform many times across the span preserved in its layers. A chamber that once looked out over a green valley might later face a dry plain. A passage used during a warm interval might be sealed by collapse before another population arrives. A shelter that feels remote today may once have stood near water, game, and movement. This matters because caves often become important when life outside becomes difficult. They are not only places of mystery, they are places of refuge, observation, storage, death, danger, and continuity. In a cold landscape, a cave mouth can block wind and hold warmth from a fire. In a hot one, it can offer shade and stable temperature. In a storm, it can become a temporary roof. In a landscape of predators, it can be a defended edge between open ground and stone. And in a world where roots, herds, and seasons decide survival, a cave can be a landmark that stays when almost everything else shifts. The climate record preserved around ancient human sites is often as important as the human evidence itself. Pollen grains can reveal plants that once grew nearby. Animal bones can show whether the surrounding environment was open, wooded, cold, wet, or dry. Isotopes in teeth and sediments can hint at diet, temperature, and water sources. Layers of flood sediment may show violent water entering the cave. Dust can speak of aridity. Charcoal can suggest fire, whether natural or human. What survives in the record suggests that the people who used caves were adapting not to one prehistoric world, but to many. Some of these changes were slow enough to become tradition. A group might pass down knowledge of where animals moved in spring, which slopes held edible plants, where water lasted longest in dry months, and which caves stayed safe when storms came. Other changes may have been abrupt enough to feel catastrophic. A volcanic eruption darkens skies and buries landscapes in ash. A sudden flood rearranges a valley. A cold snap shortens growing seasons for plants and migration windows for animals. A drought pulls life toward shrinking rivers. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient populations responded, but the pressures were real. Survival depended on flexibility. Caves also preserve the aftermath of disasters that open-air sites lose. Floods can wash bones into chambers or seal occupation layers beneath silt. Rockfalls can trap surfaces under slabs. Mineral flows can cover footprints or pigments like a slow-forming glass. Ash from distant eruptions can settle into sediments, leaving a timestamp from catastrophe. Even the absence of human activity in a layer can matter if it coincides with a harsh climatic phase. A cave may show occupation, abandonment, return, and abandonment again, each pulse tied loosely to the changing world beyond the entrance. One surprising detail is that shelter does not always mean safety. Caves can kill, roofs collapse, carbon monoxide can gather from fires in poorly ventilated spaces, predators may use the same chambers, narrow passages can trap the injured, floodwater can rise quickly in karst systems, turning refuge into a death chamber. Ancient people who used caves must have known this. Their repeated return suggests not ignorance, but judgment. They understood which spaces could be used, when, and how far inside one could go. That knowledge itself is a form of environmental intelligence. Climate also shapes who meets whom. During warmer or wetter periods, corridors may open between regions. During colder or drier ones, populations may contract into refuges. Mountains, deserts, ice sheets, and seas are not fixed barriers. They change their meaning as conditions shift. A desert can become passable when it greens. A northern plain can become rich hunting ground when cold steppe animals spread. A coastline can become a broad exposed shelf when sea levels fall. Later, the same routes vanish. The cave may sit along one of these temporary corridors, capturing evidence of movement during a window that later closed. For human relatives living before the dominance of Homo sapiens, these pressures could be severe. Neanderthals endured glacial and interglacial cycles across Eurasia, adapting to cold and seasonal landscapes but also facing population fragmentation. Denisovans and related groups seem to have occupied environments ranging from Siberian caves to high-altitude regions and perhaps far wider territories. Though the evidence remains patchy, Homo sapiens emerged within African climatic complexity, where shifting wet and dry periods may have encouraged population separations and reconnections. The cave discovery belongs to this wider pattern of humans shaped by climate instability rather than floating above it. The cave's interior can seem removed from weather, but it is connected by water. Rain enters through cracks, minerals dissolve and redeposit, drips form stalactites and stalagmites. Flood pulses carry sediment, dry periods slow formation, wet periods accelerate it. These processes not only preserve evidence, they help date it. They also remind us that the cave is a climate instrument, registering changes outside in stone. A mineral crust above a mark is not just a lid. It is the residue of ancient rainfall, chemistry, and time. If the cave contains evidence of symbolic or unusual behavior, climate does not reduce that behavior to survival, but it may frame it. Hard times can intensify the importance of gathering places, memory, group identity, and shared practices. A cave used during environmental stress may have offered more than shelter. It may have anchored people to a known landscape when other resources became uncertain. Marks in darkness may have helped reinforce belonging, teach roots, remember events, or connect generations. Scholars still debate these possibilities, and they cannot be proven easily. Yet it is too simple to divide practical survival from meaning. For ancient people, as for modern people, the two often overlap. Catastrophe also leaves psychological traces that archaeology can rarely see directly. A flood that destroys a valley, a drought that scatters herds, or a cold phase that kills familiar plants may alter how a group remembers place. The cave might become associated with survival, loss, fear, or return. None of this can be read directly from sediment, and caution is essential. But the physical record of repeated cave use across environmental changes suggests that certain places remained important through instability. In a shifting world, permanence itself can become meaningful. The cave discovery, therefore, does not stand apart from climate history. It is part of it. The dates matter because they place human action within known pulses of environmental change. The species question matters because different human groups face these pressures in different ways. The map matters because migration routes opened and closed with climate. The marks, bones, tools, and fires matter because they are traces of behavior under conditions that were never guaranteed to remain favorable. When the outside world transforms, a cave can preserve continuity. But that continuity is deceptive. The same chamber may witness different worlds passing by its entrance. One generation may see forest, another may see open steppe, another may find the entrance partly blocked, another may never know it exists. The cave's stillness contains a sequence of vanished landscapes, stacked without names. This is one reason the discovery feels so powerful. It is not only evidence of ancient minds, it is evidence of ancient minds under pressure. To carry fire into darkness while the world outside shifts through cold, drought, flood, or ecological change is to act within uncertainty. The cave may have offered shelter, but it also offered a fixed point in a moving earth, and in that fixed point, something survived a mark, a bone, a tool, a footprint, a trace of presence from beings who endured a planet that did not promise endurance in return. The dust does not settle after the discovery. It rises. A cave that seems silent from the outside can become one of the loudest places in science once its evidence reaches the wider world. Dates are questioned, Layers are re-examined, marks are reinterpreted, bone positions are debated. The identity of the makers becomes a problem that no one can solve with complete satisfaction. This is not a weakness in the story. It is the story entering its most serious phase. A discovery that truly matters does not end with astonishment. It begins a long argument over what the evidence can honestly bear. The first argument often concerns whether the traces are human-made at all. A line on stone may look deliberate, but caves are full of deceptive surfaces. Cracks form naturally, minerals stain walls, animals scratch, water drags sediment, polishes surfaces, and deposits strange shapes. Rockfalls break formations into patterns that can appear arranged. To claim intention, researchers must show more than resemblance. They must look for repetition, placement, tool marks, pigment preparation, association with human activity, and the absence of better natural explanations. Scholars still debate many cases because the boundary between pattern and intention can be thin, especially when time has damaged the evidence. The second argument concerns context. Even if a mark, tool, or structure is deliberate, does it belong to the date assigned to it? Could an object have moved downward through cracks? Could a later visitor have reached an older surface? Could sediments have been mixed by water, animals, collapse, or earlier excavation? These are not minor objections. In a cave, context is everything. A single disturbed layer can make a young object look ancient, or an ancient object look young. The evidence remains incomplete unless the cave's formation history is understood in detail, and even then some uncertainty usually survives. Then comes the argument over authorship. If the evidence is old enough to predate known Homo sapiens in the region, extinct human relatives become likely candidates, but likely is not certain. If Neanderthals are present in nearby layers, they may be the makers, yet the cave may also have been visited by others later. If Denisovan DNA appears in sediment, it proves presence but not necessarily authorship. If no bones are found at all, the makers may remain anonymous. No single explanation fully accounts for every cave discovery because ancient populations overlapped, moved, vanished, and sometimes left only traces too faint to assign. The most difficult arguments concern meaning. A deliberate mark does not automatically equal art. A placed object does not automatically equal ritual. A bone deposit does not automatically equal burial. Scientists must resist both extremes, reducing every unusual trace to accident, and turning every ambiguity into ceremony. Between these extremes lies the hard work of interpretation. A deep cave structure may show planning without revealing belief. A hand stencil may show symbolic behavior without telling us what the symbol meant. A body placed in darkness may suggest care, but it may also reflect disposal, danger, or a practice with no modern equivalent. The cave gives evidence of action more readily than evidence of thought. These debates can become intense because they touch more than technical details. They touch the boundaries of humanity. If Neanderthals made symbolic marks, then the old divide between them and Homo sapiens weakens. If early modern humans reached a region far earlier than expected, migration models must shift. If unknown populations used caves in complex ways, the human family becomes wider and stranger. Each interpretation carries consequences, and researchers know it. The argument in the dust is really an argument about how much of ourselves we're willing to recognize in the vanished. One lesser-known feature of these debates is how often old discoveries change under new methods. A cave excavated decades ago may have collections sitting in museum drawers, labelled carefully but interpreted through older assumptions. A bone once considered animal may be re-identified. A tool once thought intrusive may match a newly dated layer. Sediment saved without much excitement may yield DNA. A wall panel photographed poorly in the past may reveal marks under modern imaging. The cave discovery that rewrites history may therefore not begin with a new cave at all, but with a new question asked of old evidence. There are also arguments between different kinds of expertise. A geologist may emphasize the movement of water and minerals. An archaeologist may focus on artifacts and context. A paleoanthropologist may see population implications. A dating specialist may warn that a result gives only a minimum or maximum age. A taphonomist may point out how bones move, break, and accumulate. None of these perspectives is complete alone. The strongest interpretations come when they constrain one another. The weakest appear when one line of evidence is made to carry more weight than it can hold. Public fascination can make this harder. Once a discovery reaches headlines, caution becomes less attractive than certainty. Oldest art, first ritual, unknown species, lost civilization, and history rewritten travel faster than careful explanations of error margins and sediment disturbance. Yet the real discovery is often more interesting than the simplified version. It is not that one cave proves a dramatic secret. It is that one cave forces a network of old assumptions to bend. The slow version is less flashy, but it is usually more profound. Fringe interpretations enter the space where uncertainty remains. Some claim evidence of impossible civilizations, advanced lost technologies, or hidden historical conspiracies. These ideas often thrive because caves feel mysterious and because the real evidence is incomplete. But unsupported claims usually skip the hardest part. They do not explain the sediment, the dating, the tools, the bones, the geology, and the comparative record better than mainstream archaeology does. They add drama while removing discipline. The real cave does not need that help. Its evidence is already strange enough. The arguments continue because the stakes are real. A cave discovery may change how researchers define symbolic behavior. It may alter estimates of when populations arrived or disappeared. It may challenge assumptions about intelligence in extinct humans. It may reveal that deep prehistory contained more cultural variety than the surviving record can easily show. These are not small revisions. They affect the foundation beneath later history, beneath agriculture, cities, writing, and civilization. The dust in the cave reaches all the way to the surface. Still, disagreement does not mean failure. In archaeology, debate is often the sound of knowledge being repaired. A claim is tested, narrowed, rejected, strengthened, or transformed. Some early interpretations fade, others survive and become part of a new consensus. The cave remains the same, but the questions asked of it become sharper. That sharpening is how the past becomes more truthful. By the end of the argument, the discovery may be less simple than it seemed at first, but more important. Perhaps the cave does not prove the oldest art in the world, but it proves earlier symbolic behavior than expected. Perhaps it does not prove ritual, but it proves deliberate activity in deep darkness. Perhaps it does not identify the makers with certainty, but it makes old assumptions about their incapacity impossible to maintain. The rewrite is not always a clean replacement of one story with another. Sometimes it is a permanent complication, and that may be the most honest gift of the cave. It does not hand over certainty. It removes false certainty. It forces scholars to admit that the deep past was more crowded, more inventive, more mobile, and more difficult to classify than the old models allowed. The arguments in the dust are not noise around the discovery. They are the discovery continuing to unfold. The false trails begin where uncertainty leaves room for desire. A cave opens. The dates seem impossibly old. The markings look deliberate. The makers are unknown, and almost immediately the imagination rushes in ahead of the evidence. This is understandable. Caves invite speculation. They are dark, sealed, and ancient. They feel like places where the world might have hidden something enormous from itself, but the same qualities that make them powerful also make them vulnerable to exaggeration. A fragment becomes a code, a mark becomes a message, a difficult date becomes proof of a forbidden history. The cave is asked to carry stories it never actually told. Popular theories often begin with a real mystery and then move too quickly. A strange arrangement of stones becomes evidence of an advanced vanished civilization. A pigment mark becomes a star map. A skull fragment becomes a visitor from an impossible lineage. A gap in the archaeological record becomes a deliberate cover-up. These claims can sound exciting because they offer clean answers to incomplete evidence. They also flatter the listener with the feeling of seeing through a deception. But they usually fail where the real science begins in the details of sediment, dating, tool production, geology, anatomy, and comparison with other sites. The real evidence is slower, but stronger. It does not need a lost empire with machines, a secret priesthood, or a civilization erased from every other trace on Earth. What it shows is already extraordinary ancient humans or human relatives moving through deep darkness, using fire, leaving marks, making choices, and perhaps expressing memory or meaning long before written history. That is not a small claim. It changes the human story without requiring fantasy, in some ways. The grounded version is more unsettling than the fringe version, because it does not place mystery safely in an imaginary lost world. It places it in our own ancestry. One reason unsupported theories spread is that deep time is difficult to feel. Tens of thousands of years are almost impossible to hold in the mind. When people hear that a cave mark or structure may be older than expected, they reach for familiar explanations: civilization, temples, maps, secret knowledge. But most of human history happened before civilization in the later sense. People did not need cities to be intelligent. They did not need writing to remember. They did not need kings to develop traditions, symbols, roots, or sacred places. Assuming that meaningful behavior requires civilization is one of the quieter mistakes the cave helps correct. Another false trail comes from the belief that ancient people could not have done difficult things without outside help, lost technology, or some unknown superior group. This idea appears in many forms, and it usually reveals more about modern prejudice than ancient capacity. Prehistoric people knew their landscapes with an intimacy that modern observers often underestimate. They could track animals across difficult ground, shape stone with precision, manage fire, navigate seasons, carry knowledge across generations, and survive climates that would defeat most people today within days. The evidence remains incomplete, but nothing about deep cave activity requires impossible technology. It requires skill, planning, cooperation, and courage. There is also the temptation to turn every cave into a temple. Some may indeed have held symbolic or ritual importance, but not every mark is sacred, not every chamber is ceremonial, and not every unusual object is an offering. Ancient life, like modern life, contained mixtures of the practical, playful, fearful, social, and meaningful. A child's footprint may come from participation in an important practice, or from curiosity, or from following adults through a known route. A hand stencil may be identity, memory, teaching, or something far more ordinary. No single explanation fully accounts for all evidence, and forcing every trace into one dramatic category weakens rather than strengthens the mystery. The strongest protection against false trails is context. A claim must fit not only the object but the layer, the cave formation, the surrounding remains, the known environment, and the wider archaeological record. If someone claims a cave contains evidence of a lost advanced civilization, the question is not only whether one mark looks unusual. The question is where the tools are, where the settlements are, where the waste is, where the food remains are, where the bodies are, where the technologies are, and why none of the surrounding evidence requires such an explanation. Extraordinary societies leave ordinary debris, they leave broken things, repeated patterns, supply networks, raw material use, and ecological traces. A single ambiguous sign cannot replace all of that. This does not mean mainstream archaeology has always been right. It has not. Old assumptions have underestimated ancient people, especially extinct human relatives. Some discoveries now widely discussed were once treated with skepticism because they challenged established models. But there is a difference between revising history with evidence and replacing evidence with suspicion. The cave discovery matters precisely because it survives careful questioning. It is not powerful because it escapes science. It is powerful because science cannot easily make it ordinary again. A surprising detail in the history of archaeology is that some of the most revolutionary findings did not become more mysterious as they were studied. They became more specific. The mystery did not vanish, but it changed shape. A strange stain becomes a prepared pigment. A suspected natural scratch becomes an engraved line. A supposed modern intrusion becomes ancient through secure dating, or, just as importantly, a famous claim weakens when better evidence shows disturbance or misinterpretation. This is not a loss. It is the discipline cleaning its own mirror. The real past can survive correction. Fantasy usually cannot. False trails also flatten ancient humans into props. In fringe stories, the makers of cave traces often become either helpless primitives borrowing from superior beings or secret geniuses hiding a complete lost system from the world. Both versions miss the more interesting truth. Ancient humans were not simple, and they were not modern people in costume. Their intelligence was shaped by different pressures, materials, landscapes, dangers, and social worlds. They may have had forms of meaning that do not translate into later religion, art, science, or politics. The cave does not become richer when it is forced to resemble a modern conspiracy. It becomes richer when it is allowed to remain ancient. The unsupported theories will continue, because caves will always attract them. Darkness is generous to imagination. Missing evidence can be made to look like suppression. Scientific caution can be mistaken for fear. But the real story asks for something harder than belief in hidden grandeur. It asks for patience. It asks the listener to care about a mineral crust, a layer of sediment, a damaged bone, a fragment of DNA, a torch stain, a footprint, and the difference between what is known and what is inferred. It asks for wonder without surrendering judgment. And when that patience is granted, the cave becomes more astonishing, not less. The real discovery does not show an impossible civilization hiding under the earth. It shows that the possible was wider than anyone expected. It shows that minds far older than writing could engage with darkness in ways that still unsettle us. It shows that extinct relatives may have stood closer to the threshold of symbolism, memory, or ritual than the old stories allowed. It shows that human history is not diminished by losing easy myths. It is deepened. The false trails fall away, and the cave remains, No golden machinery, no secret alphabet explaining everything, no proof of a vanished superculture directing the first humans from behind a curtain. Just stone, bone, pigment, ash, silence, and time. Just enough evidence to humble certainty, just enough mystery to keep the question alive. That is the more difficult truth, and the better one. What the cave takes away is almost as important as what it gives. It gives evidence, yes, traces, dates, surfaces, bones, tools, sediments, and the hard patience of stone. But it also removes old comforts. It takes away the clean staircase of progress. It takes away the easy division between clever us and dim others. It takes away the idea that civilization is the beginning of meaningful human life. It takes away the belief that the past becomes simple just because it is distant. By the time the cave has been studied, argued over, and placed into the wider record, the familiar story has not collapsed completely, but it has changed shape. It is lower, wider, stranger, and more crowded. For centuries, people have imagined human history as a rise from darkness into light. The metaphor is powerful, but caves make it awkward. Here, darkness is not merely ignorance. It is a place people entered with skill. It is a landscape they navigated, marked, remembered, and perhaps transformed. The old story says light belongs to knowledge and darkness to the primitive unknown. The cave replies with a quieter truth: someone carried light into darkness long before writing, long before cities, long before anyone built monuments visible from a king's road. If there is a beginning here, it is not a sudden dawn. It is a small flame moving carefully through stone. The discovery also weakens the myth of a single human breakthrough. It is tempting to imagine one moment when the human mind became fully modern, when art, ritual, language, memory, and imagination suddenly arrived together. But the archaeological record rarely supports such neatness. Behaviors appear unevenly. They gather, vanish, reappear, differ by region, and sometimes show up in forms that do not fit later categories. A mark in one cave, a burial-like deposit in another, pigments elsewhere, ornaments in another landscape. Complex tools across vast spans of time, together they suggest a gradual, branching deepening of human possibility. The evidence remains incomplete, but it does not look like one switch being thrown. This matters because the old boundary between Homo sapiens and other human relatives has often been moralized without anyone quite admitting it. To call one group symbolic and another merely practical is not just a technical distinction. It shapes how their lives are imagined. It decides whether their dead are treated as bodies or as people, whether their marks are seen as scratches or signs, whether their survival strategies are intelligence or instinct. The cave does not prove that all human relatives thought the same way. It does something more careful and more disruptive. It makes contempt harder. If Neanderthals, Denisovans, or another extinct group created some of these traces, then intelligence was not a crown placed only on the head of Homo sapiens. It was a family resemblance with variations. Some branches may have carried capacities that overlapped with ours. Others may have developed forms of knowledge we cannot recognize because the materials did not preserve, or because we keep looking for ourselves in the evidence. Scholars still debate how far these comparisons can go, but the cave forces a change in posture. The vanished are no longer merely background figures in the rise of us. They become actors in their own worlds. Even if the cave traces were made by early Homo sapiens, the consequences remain unsettling. They show that the human story was already rich before the things usually called history began. Before agriculture, people knew roots, seasons, animals, stone, fire, and darkness. Before writing, they made marks that could outlast them. Before cities, they gathered around places whose meanings may have been carried in speech, gesture, and memory. Before kings, they crossed landscapes with knowledge precise enough to survive. Civilization did not create human depth. It organized and amplified some parts of it, while burying or replacing others. One of the cave's most surprising lessons is how fragile the evidence of intelligence can be. If a mark had not been sealed by mineral growth, it might have vanished. If a footprint had dried too slowly, it might have blurred. If a bone had decayed in acidic soil rather than limestone shelter, it might have left no trace. If sea levels had risen over the site, the entire discovery might be unreachable. This means absence in the record is not absence in life. There may have been songs, stories, painted skins, carved wood, woven fibers, body markings, dances, taboos, jokes, grief, and teaching traditions across deep time, all gone because they were made of perishable things. The cave preserves a fraction, and that fraction may still underestimate the whole. The discovery also removes the comfort of inevitability. Homo sapiens survived, but survival is not proof that the path was guaranteed. Other humans endured for hundreds of thousands of years. They adapted, learned, and persisted through climates that shifted again and again. Their disappearance was not a simple failure of intelligence. It may have involved population size, environmental instability, competition, interbreeding, disease, resource pressure, chance, and many factors that cannot be separated cleanly. No single explanation fully accounts for the narrowing of humanity into one surviving species. The cave reminds us that the world could have ended differently. There is a human consequence in that realization. The past becomes less like a triumphant inheritance and more like a field of losses. Every extinct human group represents not only genes and bones, but vanished ways of seeing the world. Their knowledge of landscapes is gone. Their languages, if they had them in forms comparable to ours, are gone. Their gestures and social rules are gone. Their memories of caves, rivers, animals, and ancestors are gone. Only traces remain. And even those survive by accident. To study them is to feel both closeness and distance at once. The cave also challenges how modern people measure progress. Later civilizations build cities, write laws, raise temples, wage wars, calculate calendars, and leave ruins large enough to dominate landscapes. These achievements are real, but they can make earlier lives seem small by comparison. A cave discovery reverses the scale. It suggests that a single deliberate mark in deep time may be as important, in its own way, as a wall built by an empire, not because it is larger, but because it shows the roots of attention. History is not only the story of accumulation, it is also the story of first relationships between mind, place, body, and memory. And there is another loss, the loss of certainty about ourselves. Humans often define themselves by contrast. We are not animals because we make tools, until tool-making is found elsewhere. We are not animals because we plan, until planning appears more widely. We are not like extinct relatives because we symbolize until their possible symbols emerge from caves. Each boundary shifts. Each shift does not diminish humanity. It places humanity back into nature, which is where it always was. The cave does not make humans less remarkable. It makes remarkableness older, broader, and less lonely. What survives in the record suggests that the deep past was full of thresholds. The threshold between daylight and cave dark, between practical action and symbolic attention, between one human population and another, between survival and memory, between what can be known and what must remain inferred. The cave sits at all of these thresholds, quietly dismantling the idea that human history begins only when it becomes easy to read. By taking away old certainties, the cave gives a harsher kind of wonder. It asks the modern world to admire without simplifying, to imagine without inventing, to accept kinship without pretending all ancient people were the same. It asks for humility in the face of beings who left almost nothing and yet were not nothing. They stood in landscapes now gone, under skies no one named in writing, beside animals that vanished, among relatives whose faces are partly known and partly lost. They entered caves and left traces that survived the collapse of their worlds. The discovery rewrites human history because it changes the emotional center of the story. The human past is no longer a narrow road leading proudly to the present. It is a deep cavern system, branching in darkness, full of passages explored and abandoned, some sealed forever, some only now opening under careful light. The cave takes away the illusion that we stand at the end of a simple ascent. It leaves us with something less flattering and more true. We are the surviving edge of a much older, stranger and more fragile humanity. The cave at the centre of this story is not alone. Once its evidence begins to change the shape of human history, other caves seem to answer from across the world, each with its own fragment of the same larger disturbance. One cave preserves paintings that once seemed to mark the sudden arrival of modern imagination. Another holds bones of human relatives who are not supposed to behave with such complexity. Another keeps footprints in soft clay, or hand stencils sealed beneath mineral crust, or a tooth that opens an entire population into view. These places are separated by geography, climate, and time, yet together they form a hidden archive beneath the surface of the familiar world. Some caves transform the story through art. In Ice Age Europe, painted animals, signs, and hand marks once encouraged the idea of a sudden creative explosion, as if the human mind woke fully formed in the Upper Paleolithic. The images are still astonishing, but the idea of suddenness has weakened. Older marks in other regions, earlier pigments, engraved patterns, and symbolic objects suggest that imagination did not begin in one famous chamber or one dramatic cultural dawn. It grew through many experiments, some preserved, most lost. Scholars still debate the meanings of these images, but the wider pattern is clear enough. Cave art is not the beginning of the human mind. It is one surviving expression of something deeper. Other caves transform the story through bones. A small fragment, easily overlooked, can reveal a vanished population. A tooth can carry ancestry. A finger bone can become the first physical clue to people previously known only through genetic relationships. In some cases, caves have shown that ancient human groups overlapped in ways once unexpected, using the same regions across different periods, perhaps encountering one another, perhaps avoiding one another, perhaps leaving traces that later researchers struggle to separate. The evidence remains incomplete, but the old loneliness of Homo sapiens has been replaced by a crowded, shifting humanity. There are caves where the dead complicate the living. Human remains placed or accumulated in difficult chambers raise questions that are still fiercely debated. Were these burials, disposals, accidents, predator collections, or something else entirely? In some places, bodies appear in settings that suggest repeated deposition rather than random death. But proving intention across deep time is difficult. The uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a reminder that care for the dead, fear of the dead, Use of dangerous places and symbolic treatment of bodies may not have developed in ways that match later customs. The cave gives bones, not explanations. There are also caves where footprints make the ancient world suddenly intimate. A trackway in clay can preserve a journey more directly than almost any artifact. Adults and children move through darkness. Someone slips. Someone steps around a wet patch. A group follows a passage that is not meant for modern eyes. Such traces collapse time with almost painful force because they record motion rather than objects. A painted animal may feel distant and formal, but a footprint is an unfinished gesture. It is a living body passing through, unaware that the ground will remember. Echoes from other caves also show how uneven preservation can be. Some regions have spectacular art because limestone systems sealed and protected surfaces. Others may have had equally rich symbolic worlds made on bark, skin, sand, wood, or exposed rock that did not survive. Some populations lived near coast now drowned. Others used open-air camps erased by erosion. Caves can therefore distort as well as reveal. They make certain kinds of evidence visible while allowing others to vanish. No single explanation fully accounts for the global pattern of survival. The archive is powerful, but it is biased. Yet that bias has become useful because caves often preserve what the surface destroys. They preserve ancient DNA in cold sediment. They preserve mineral-sealed marks. They preserve smoke on ceilings, bones in stable temperatures, and sediments protected from wind. They allow modern researchers to return with new methods and ask questions earlier generations could not ask. A cave excavated a century ago may still hold unstudied material in storage. A wall photographed decades ago may reveal hidden marks under digital enhancement. A sediment sample may become a genetic document. The cave continues to speak because science learns new ways to listen. The comparison between caves is what turns a single discovery into a transformation. One site may be dismissed as an anomaly. Two create discomfort. Many force revision. When different caves across different regions suggest earlier complexity, broader human abilities, deeper symbolic behavior, or unexpected population movement, the old story cannot simply absorb them one by one without changing. The pattern becomes the message. Ancient humanity was not waiting for civilization to become interesting. It was already experimenting with place, sign, death, memory, and darkness. Still, each cave keeps its own character. Some are grand and cathedral-like, with walls that seem almost prepared for images. Others are cramped, wet, and hostile. Some were lived in repeatedly near their mouths. Others appear to have been entered only for brief acts far from daylight. Some hold traces of Homo sapiens. Others may belong to Neanderthals or to more elusive relatives. Some are secure in interpretation. Others remain contested. Scholars still debate the details because the details matter. It is not enough to say caves changed history. Each cave must be allowed to change it in its own way. One surprising connection among many cave discoveries is the repeated importance of thresholds, entrances, narrow passages, deep chambers, hidden recesses, vertical shafts, pools, and walls with unusual shapes all seem to attract attention in different times and places. This does not prove a universal cave religion, and such a claim would go too far, but it suggests that certain features of underground space repeatedly mattered to human perception. Darkness, echo, enclosure, danger, and the transition from outside to inside may have carried significance across cultures because they act directly on the body. The cave shapes experience before anyone gives it meaning. That shaping may explain why caves remain powerful even now. Modern visitors often feel awe in them without needing to believe what ancient people believed. The temperature drops, sound changes, light narrows, stone surrounds the body. Time becomes visible in mineral growth and buried floors. A cave makes deep time physical. It is one thing to know that humans lived tens of thousands of years ago. It is another to stand where their hands touch stone. As more caves are studied, the human past becomes less like a single origin story and more like a constellation. Each site is a point of light, separated by darkness but connected by pattern. A hand stencil in one place, an engraved line in another, a child's footprint elsewhere, a bone fragment in a cold chamber, a mineral ring deep underground, a layer of sediment carrying vanished. DNA. None explains everything. Together they reveal a world in which ancient humans repeatedly crossed the boundary between survival and meaning. The cave discovery that began this story therefore belongs to a wider underground chorus. It rewrites history not because it stands alone as a miracle, but because it joins other evidence already pressing against old assumptions. Its echoes are found wherever the deep past has been sealed away long enough to survive in painted chambers, fossil-bearing passages, buried entrances, flooded systems, and museum boxes waiting for a second look. The story's not finished because the archive is not exhausted. Every new cave reminds us that history is partly dependent on where stone happened to protect memory. If one roof had collapsed differently, if one mineral crust had not formed, if one passage had flooded too soon, if one bone had dissolved, a major part of the human story might still be missing. The past did not arrange itself for our understanding. It survived unevenly, accidentally, and often barely. Caves are among the rare places where that accident works in our favour. And so the echoes continue. One cave changes a date, another changes a map, another changes the imagined abilities of a vanished people. Another reveals that a population existed at all. Another does not answer a question so much as make the old answer impossible. Together, they turn the underground world into a second history of humanity, not written in ink or carved monuments, but in ash, bone, mineral, pigment, and silence. The cave at the centre is one doorway. Beyond it, there are others, and each one opens into a past larger than the one we thought we knew. The cave still has more to say, and that may be its most unsettling quality. Even after the dates are measured, the bones studied, the sediments sampled, the marks scanned, and the argument sharpened, the place does not feel emptied, it feels only partly translated. The discovery has forced history to widen, but it has not closed the mystery. It has opened a door, and beyond that door are more chambers, some physical, some scientific, some philosophical. All still dark enough to resist certainty. Future work may change the story again. New dating methods may tighten old ranges or overturn confident claims. Sediment DNN may identify visitors where no bones survive. Microscopic analysis may reveal pigments, fibers, plant residues, or traces of fire too small for earlier researchers to see. Artificial imaging may expose marks hidden under mineral skins or dismissed as natural stains. Old museum collections may produce new surprises when examined with questions no one thought to ask before. What survives in the record suggests that the greatest discoveries are not always waiting in untouched caves. Some are waiting in evidence already found, not yet understood. The cave also leaves larger questions unanswered. Who entered the deepest chambers first? What did the darkness mean to them? Were the marks signs, memories, teachings, rituals, experiments, or something that no modern word can hold? Did different human groups share these behaviours, or did similar practices emerge separately across the human family? Scholars still debate these questions because the evidence remains incomplete, and it should remain incomplete rather than be forced into a false ending. The cave's silence is not an empty silence. It is the silence of a witness that has given only fragments. What has changed is the range of possibility. Ancient humans and their relatives can no longer be placed comfortably in narrow categories of instinct, survival, and crude necessity. They moved through landscapes with knowledge. They carried fire into darkness. They left traces that survived longer than languages, longer than nations, longer than every civilization that later claimed permanence. No single explanation fully accounts for all of it. But the old story, the simple story, is gone. The cave remains open, even when its entrance is sealed, protected, or hidden from the public. It remains open as a question. It asks what else has been missed. It asks how many vanished minds left no durable trace at all. It asks whether human history is not a straight road behind us, but a vast underground system of branching passages, many collapsed, many drowned, many still waiting for light. And somewhere in that darkness, the first hand still reaches toward the wall. In the end, the cave does not give humanity a clean origin. It gives something quieter and more difficult depth. It reminds us that before the first city wall, before the first written name, before kings counted years and priests guarded calendars, there were beings moving carefully through stone corridors with fire in their hands. They lived in worlds that changed around them. They knew hunger, fear, weather, kinship, and loss. They watched animals vanish into valleys that no longer exist. They crossed lands now drowned by seas. They touched walls in darkness and left behind the faintest proof that they had been there. Most of them are gone beyond recovery. Their voices are gone. Their gestures are gone. Their stories, if they told them, are gone. What remains is uneven and accidental: a tooth, a track, a smear of red, a darkened ceiling, a broken stone, a chamber no one entered again for tens of thousands of years. Yet from such small remains, the past widens. The silence becomes inhabited. That is why the cave matters, not because it solves everything, but because it teaches us to be less certain about what humans were and more careful with what they may have been. It asks us to imagine intelligence without arrogance, mystery without fantasy, and ancestry without a single throne at the top. Long after the researchers leave, the cave returns to stillness. Water keeps falling drop by drop. Minerals keep growing over old surfaces. Dust gathers where feet once passed. Outside, the modern world rushes on, bright and loud and temporary. Inside, the stone keeps its older rhythm, and somewhere beyond the last reach of daylight, the human story waits, unfinished, with one handprint fading slowly into the dark,